Hello.
Hey,
Hello.
how are you?
How are you?
Good, you?
I'm good.
So let's wait a minute to see if anyone else joins and then we can get started. Okay, let's get started. There's only one from Naman who's not here, so I'll verbalize. He's planning to contribute to topology service, mostly on the Go side. Um, and to bring him on some of the issues. I thought of like 5 things that we can improve on topology service. Haven't created issues on those. I'll try and find some time today to create these issues. But if anyone else can think of anything from a topology service perspective on what we can improve on the code base, that would be appreciated. So, yeah. Um, Anything else we want to discuss? Like, we have an hour in this meeting, so anything that comes to mind around cells, I'm more than happy to
Maybe we
look at
can
it.
talk quickly about like I mean, you created already issue for that, Steve, which is that we use cell ID instead of cell name.
Mm-hmm.
So using cell, which is good idea. Like I think in the beginning we started by when Camille at some point suggested like configuration, we agreed on cell name because it's also unique. Uh, but then like at some point cell ID was added, and probably now it makes sense to use cell ID like across like between all the components. Yeah, this issue. Um, so like maybe that brings the question, and I thought it makes sense to ask it here. In that this tissue project, we have like all these cells, and they have some internal names. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
so these internal names should not be used as part of the application, as part of the configuration. This is just like something to be referred to in the
Yeah. Yeah. So what you're referring is the tenant ID. So let me share my
uh,
screen to so let's look at cell tissue, right? And so if you're not familiar with dedicated tooling, the inception of a cell, in our case, or the inception of tenant, is a tenant model. So if we look at rings here, and let's just look at the prod one here. So a tenant model is purely just a simple JavaScript JSON file with a few settings here. So for example, here we have tenant ID. And if you're familiar with AWS, this is similar to ARN, right? Which is just a random string that is a unique identifier for everything in AWS. And it follows the same model. So this tenant ID is the unique identifier for all infrastructure related things. So it's the unique identifier for the database name, the the object storage name, and so on and so forth. So this is a purely identifier for the infrastructure and nothing related to cell, meaning, for example, here we have cells.cellid2. We could have a possibility where we say we're going to tear down this tenant, bring it up in another tenant with the same cell ID. So imagine like a backup and restore kind of scenario. The cell ID is the same, but the tenant ID might change for whatever reason, right? Like, let's imagine this is just a pre-QA cell. We mess something up. We just want to delete it and bootstrap it again. So we use the same cell ID, but the tenant ID changes because we want to provision a new cell. So the only thing that ties the tenant model to the application is the cell ID here. And this is what will configure the Rails application with cell ID and things like that. And that's why I guess I proposed to drop the cell name part, just because cell name was being derived from cell ID, and we had some endpoints using cell ID for, like, for example, the classification endpoint uses cell ID, but then we had some the sequencing endpoints using cell name. So it was some confusion there. So the tenant is purely an infrastructure concern, and at first we wanted to look at if we put the tenant ID as cell ID, but that felt risky, coupling the application ID with the infrastructure ID. So we wanted to keep them separate like that.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, if we go back in time, probably like something we should have done, which is like to try to fix the APIs between the components, so that we all like to be strict about that and not to add. That's what caused this confusion with the ID and the name.
Yeah.
What about like the session prefix in this case? Like we always want to have it as cell ID, right? Like there's no.
Yeah, cell dash ID, right? Yeah. Like, ironically enough, when we implemented the session prefix configuration inside of dedicated, we did just do ID dash and then the random hash. But the HTTP router, understandably so, did it cell dash ID dash random hash, right? I think that's more to make it easier for developers, I guess, when they're looking at session cookies, like what does this ID mean? So like we follow the same kind of pattern for routable tokens rather than cell, we use C. It's just to make it clear that, hey, this ID means for a cell, rather than a project ID and things like that, or whatever ID, right? So the reason the SARSIP prefix has sal is just to be clear, like what the ID means, basically, rather than anything else.
Because now we want to remove this configuration for the cell name in the Rails application, we want to keep it ID. But now, because we have also configuration for the session prefix, which was probably the first MR to be added to the Rails application regarding cells, because this is what we wanted to configure, and we were doing like POCs for that long time ago. So I'm wondering now if it makes sense to keep this configuration, this session prefix, just like, and make the Rails application add the session prefix or the cell ID in the session prefix if there was topology service configured. And if there's no topology service, then it's gonna fall back to the default.
Well, not topology service. If it's not if the topology service URL is configured, if it's the cell ID that's configured, right? Because like we can have a scenario where topology service is configured for whatever reason by mistake, but the cell ID is not configured, then the session prefix will not be generated correctly because the cell ID is empty, right?
That's yeah. Okay, it's good that you brought this up because there was discussion about that in some MR recently. Peter and Tong were involved in that. So I mentioned something like I said the Rails application is running in cell mode. I came up with this name. That means that the Rails application knows that it's part of a cluster.
Yep.
So when does it do that? Is it when the topology service is configured? Is it when the cell ID is configured? Because at the moment, by default, we have cell ID 1, always, unless we change that. So the cell ID is there, but the topology service is not configured. So that's why probably we need to agree on that as part of the API. Okay, when do we run in cell mode, and when do we add the session prefix?
Yeah, so I think so. Regarding session prefix, I think that is technical debt that we incurred right now, just because, as you said, session prefix was the first one, and then we're introducing cell ID. So when we introduce cell ID, we can try and drop this session prefix if we want to remove some technical debt there. Now, the other question is, what configures Rails to be a cell in cell cluster or not? I think if we just look at phase 3 and 4, it's only cell ID, because phase 3 and 4 are the ones that are using cell ID to generate the routable tokens and session prefixes. In phase 5, it will be both cell ID and topology service, right? Because a cluster, a cell in phase 5 will start creating the sequences depending on the topology service, and will start claiming globally unique resources, right? So right now, if we just put in like blinders and just look at phase 3 and 4, then cell ID is the only configuration setting that will make it run in cell mode. In the future, in phase 5, we would need, from a Rails application, we would need both the cell ID and also the topology service. So if we're thinking from a validation perspective, and if we're thinking like very on a micro level, like what to implement first, I would implement the first cell ID and roll that out for JDK, Omnibus, and Helmchart, like we discussed. And then topology service URL will be added part of phase 5. Now, we can work on it this week if we want to, like whoever has the capacity. But like right now, if we're just looking at phase 3 and phase 4, I would just look at cell ID, because topology service URL is only going to be used. Correct me if I'm wrong here, though. It's only going to be used when we're provisioning seeding the database with sequences and claiming resources on the Rails side of things. And that's a phase 5 concern at the moment. So we'll just look at phase 3 and 4 with cell ID.
Yeah, there was some issue also for that. I will look it up. Like if I think it's related to when to know if we are running in cell or not. Yeah, that makes sense. Like I would also like I'm in favor of like just depending on cell ID. What do you think should be the behavior of the application if there was cell ID? Let's talk about phase 5. If the Rails application starts, there's cell ID, but there's no topology service configured. I suggest that the application should fail to start.
Exactly. I would agree with that. It is a condition, right? If cell ID is configured, then topology service needs to be configured when we're in phase 5. Right now, we're not in phase 5, so that would be, if we implement it today, that would be optional, and we'll have an issue in phase 5 to make it a requirement when cell ID is present, if that makes sense. I'm not sure how this, like, I don't know how to say it, the GitLab YAML file, so let me double check. Yeah, so I would imagine, and this is just me thinking out loud, right? I would imagine this would look like here, like we'll have, in phase 5, we'll have cell topology URL or whatever. So everything cell related
No,
will be
we have that. There's
okay.
different configuration for topology service. It's different than the cell. So we have cell, we have section for cell, and we have section for topology service. Because like in the Rails application, there are two keys.
Okay. Is there a specific reason for that, or?
I think that when was this I can look up the MR where like I discussed that with Camille. The idea there was a different options for that. I think the idea was that cell ID is something different than configuring the topology service. So it's two different things. I will look up the MR.
Okay. I don't want to reopen an old discussion. Like
Yeah.
intuitively, anything cell related should be under cell, and topology service seem to be cell related. But again, I don't want to open up old discussions if they don't make sense.
I had the very same question or confusion as well. Like if you just said in phase 5, we should raise an error if cell ID is provided, but TS is not configured, right? So they are dependent on each other. And there's no other cases where cell ID might be used without TS in the application, then we should like move topology service configuration within the cell key, I'd say.
Yeah. At least I don't see a reason why, where at least like in phase 5 plus, I wouldn't see a reason why cell ID and topology service shouldn't be present together, in the sense um, like when Rails will use the topology service, it will have to send the cell ID to claim resources and to get the sequencing. Uh, that is phase 5, and yeah, like in phase 5 for for claiming resources and sequencing, we need the topology service URL. So yeah, I would say they depend one on the other in phase 5.
Yeah, makes sense. Currently, just you know, currently we default the cell ID to be 1 when initializing a Rails. So this we should also need to take care of for phase 5.
Yeah, I mean we can leave it as 1 always. I'm curious, how would this affect
then
self-managed
you
customers?
Yeah, this is exactly the question. If we default to 1, at some point topology service won't be enabled and the application will crash, right? This is what we want. So we already making the cell ID optional in Omnibus, and we will make it optional for the Helm chart. But in GTK currently it's mandatory, and it's also defaults to 1 in the Rails application itself. And this is the last piece we need to change. It shouldn't have any default. It should be like the configuration should be directed from the outside. Not like there should not be any CSL ID default within the Rails.
Yeah. So coming in phase 6, which is where we take the existing GitLab.com infrastructure and make it a cell. One of the first step is to configure cell ID 1 for that application, because cell ID is a nullable config field. Is that what you're saying, Peter?
Yes, and currently, even if we do so, right now, if we deploy GitLab.com, cell ID is already run 1 because it's defaulting to 1 currently from the application standpoint, and this shouldn't be the case.
Yeah, I agree. So do we what action items do we have to take on this? So do we have to make, or are you already handling it, Peter?
I can handle it. Omar can help me to handle it as well. I see some points to make the cell ID not default to 1. To also, if we decide to nest a topology service within the cell key, this needs to change as well. And basically making cell ID optional, right? And this is currently not optional.
Yeah. So action items. Let me share my screen to make sure. We're all on the same page.
Mm-hmm.
So action item is to make cell ID as nullable, meaning cell disabled by default. Nest topology service URL. Is it that's what it's called? Dot URL, I think.
I think there's more, like this URL and certificates, I think, as well.
Oh yeah, certificates. Got it.
Yeah,
Yes, you're right.
yeah, basically,
Topology. Yeah, topology dot star. Um,
And to be fair, I think there's no harm of already letting the application, although, yeah, we should actually raise perhaps if cell ID is defined and topology service is not enabled.
Yeah, we could.
Yeah, well, it would crash nowadays because GDK defines always a cell ID and topology services. Well, it's enabled, right? Most of the time.
No,
The client.
GDK, that's something we like because it has been done recently. So if the HTTP router is not configured, no, sorry, topology service is not configured in the client, the whole block is disabled. So we don't pass anything to the GitLab YAML file. So both
right.
of the keys are not there. Anyway,
Okay.
but I mean, GDK is usually the first thing that's tested, and the first thing that usually fails.
Yeah. I think we should make sure that all three components like GDK, Omnibus, and Hemchat behaves the same way, kind of, right? And we have a difference right now from GDK to Omnibus already, and this is why I kicked off the discussion when adding the cell ID to Omnibus, like to clarify, I think, because I was confused. And yeah,
No,
so
it is confusing. Yeah.
What about the session prefix? Because that's something when we introduced that in a different YAML file, like as I said, like the first MR, there was suggestion from Camille to put that in I think move that to the YAML file, to GitLab YAML file, where we have these settings now. We didn't get to do that, and I think it just makes sense now that we are consolidating this config to put the session prefix also as part, maybe as part of the cell configuration. I mean, session prefix probably makes sense for any in general, but just having that as part of the cell probably makes sense.
So what you're saying is we still make session prefix configurable?
It's already configurable, but like maybe moving it under like the cell
The cell,
configuration
okay,
in the same file. But that of course would prevent any self-managed from configuring the session prefix if they want to change it. But I don't think anyone wants to change that. Like what's there's no reason for it. Like we just keep it as part of the cell configuration.
I'd be a bit like I'd like to see what distribution think, because that would mean session prefix right now is something that people can configure today, and that I guess would be a breaking change for customers. If we just move it around on cells and they want session prefix. So I think we're a little bit too late, unfortunately, unless we wait for the major release. But I guess that's just because session prefix existed before the concept of cell ID existed.
Okay.
But it feels like a breaking change, especially from a config perspective for users, unfortunately.
Yeah. I mean, something can be done probably like if cell is enabled, then we can maybe ignore the session prefix configured like there and just like set it to cell ID regardless of what the session prefix is. This is just an idea because this would reduce the mistakes in case like we set the ID to 5 but the session prefix to 7 or something, and then like there's a mismatch.
It's convention over configuration, which we appreciate over we appreciate that. So yeah, let's maybe, can you open up an issue to discuss that, to see if we can the session prefix for when cell ID is defined, we'll use the cell ID rather than
Mm.
the session prefix, and like think it through a little bit to see if we're gonna make a bigger mess than we have already. So yeah.
Mhm. Okay.
But are we clear about the cell ID part? Like Peter, is that a bit more clear for you? And like, do you have the right action items? Cool.
Yes, I am.
What do you
Thank
think that? What do you think about like documenting these things in the handbook so that we are all on the same page, and then we like make up like we open MRs to change that in the application so that we can like refer back to this config to the handbook.
Yeah, so what you're saying is in the handbook, we write down that the cell ID is the only unique identifier, and anything with cell ID is supposed to be generated, not configured, like cell name. If we ever decide to continue using cell name and things like that. Yeah, I like that. Is that something you can take on as
Okay,
well?
yeah, I will do it.
That's awesome. I appreciate it.
Speaking of documentation, when adding the cell ID to Omnibus, usually what we do in Omnibus is to reference or provide a link to a user documentation, right? And we don't have any user or product documentation related to cell. So one idea was perhaps to either link what we have with the closest related to cell, which is organization, but as Stong pointed out, this might be the wrong link to choose from. My idea was to link blueprints, which is weird because this is basically user-facing documentation or user-facing part. So I think we should, and this is what Tom suggested, perhaps add a little bit of product documentation related to cell. It doesn't have to be big. So perhaps instead of adding to the handbook, like the cell ID or like what we do with the cell ID and how a cell name is inferred, we could perhaps add a product documentation. I'm not sure if
That's a really good idea. So I think we already, like Omnibus already does this inside of the administration side. Let me find it. Uh, so I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but like for example, we have this one. I don't know, like not postfix, what's
yeah,
the bad name?
yeah, you are talking about configuring Omnibus, right?
Yes,
And
exactly.
configuration related specific to cells. Yeah, this we could do, but we are also I'm talking about user documentation related to the product itself, to GitLab. So there's no mention.
Isn't the administration product facing documentation, or do we have a specific split on that?
Can you open up
Sure.
I thought
So for example,
it was
let's
related
look.
to it is okay, you're right.
So
Yeah.
like it's under administer, and like for example, let's look at console, right? It's saying the tier that's available offering, so
Okay.
whatever prerequisites and configure console nodes, and then we can do maybe one here for cells, and then do what Omar explained, where instead of the handbook Omar, we can do it in here and say like cell ID will be the single source of truth to generate things and so on and so forth.
I
So
like it.
that will like consolidate everything into one place rather than handbook and user documentation.
I like it. I haven't looked into Helm charts yet because we have to add cell ID to Helm charts as well. I'm not sure if we should we need to add another set of documentation just for Helm chart or just can link from I don't know.
Let me
because
try and remember.
Because the way the application will be configured remains, right? So we always have to pass cell ID or none, basically. So I'm not sure if it will need to repeat the documentation in two places, right? And only have a single source of truth for that.
Yeah, so the hand charts have their own configurations, their own documentation, sorry. So it's under hand charts, configure, and then like in our case, it would be probably web service, maybe Sidekick in the future. And here that defines the all the values and the documentation around that. But then we can maybe link to
Yes. Okay.
other parts, right? So
I agree because the
yeah.
administration section you just brought up as example, you use console. It's very specific to Omnibus, right? It's not. It's or
Yes, it is.
when they are talking about settings, they always talk about Omnibus settings and not Helm charts. But perhaps we can find, Omar, like a way to more generically talk about how cell ID is set and how other values are inferred from the cell ID. So it's not only specific to Omnibus, so we can reuse the documentation to
I
link
would
from
check
Helm
with the
charts.
distribution team as well to see if they have an already established pattern around that. Like, how do they document a configuration field for both Helm chart and Omnibus in a single place? If they have a pattern like that, then maybe we can try and reuse that pattern. Because I think that's mostly their wheelhouse at this point. So,
Good idea. Thank you.
So you are suggesting like somehow to also have some place probably in the documentation, in the product documentation for sales configuration.
Yeah,
I think so. Yeah.
I can create the page and then we like start with something and then we figure out the navigation part, like where to add that. But I can start with the markdown so that we discuss that in parallel until we agree.
Yeah. Sweet.
thank you.
Yeah, let's make sure all what we just discussed are inside of the issue or issues in this case. But yeah, this was a really good conversation. Anything else we want to talk about around cell ID?
No, I think it's fine for now. We can, if there's something, we can continue on the MRs themselves as well.
Okay, so maybe I can add one thing that I just thought of. I'd like to pick your brain around integration tests around with HTTP router and topology service. The more reviews I do on topology service and HTTP router, the more I'm seeing at least a little bit some isolation where there are some assumptions, and not to bring a person in like and highlight, but like one review that I was doing this morning is this one. The authorization basic, supporting authorization basic. So one thing that I saw was that to the topology service, we're sending classify to cell ID with this value. So this value is basically taking the decoded string from the authentication and taking the cell ID to classify it, right? One thing that I noticed, let me try and see the comment I left. I left it somewhere. I'm sure I did. Why isn't it showing up? There we go. This way. So this one. So it is because, so the topology service, we end up sending, like with the current implementation, we end up sending this one. So classify by cell ID, cell dash 1235, which is not correct because the topology service expects a cell ID, not a string with cell, right? And this is like a classic thing, like one service is expecting something, the other service is sending something else. And this wasn't caught during testing, like unit test or anything like that. That I caught it by mistake when I was doing manual testing to understand something. And this is purely because the HTTP router does not spin up a topology service server and run some classification around it, right? So do you think adding integration tests between HTTP router and topology servers would be useful in the longer run to prevent issues like these? Or do you think right now it's not something that we should look into?
I was thinking about that the whole time, and we were doing like this changes to GDK. It like because we were doing like testing, but because there is a lot of like combination of configuration that we like pass through or session prefix or whatever. So there's something that can change but break for someone else. That we are missing some like integration tests that at least we can run with GDK. And make sure that when we send request with this session prefix, like it goes to cell 2, it goes to cell 1, and so yeah. But I'm not sure
So
how much
so you're
capacity
thinking
we
a
have,
step.
and if there's something Andy wanted to do as well.
Yeah, I think you're thinking a bit ahead in that sense. Like you're talking about end-to-end tests, right? Like like we spin up a browser, use the login, and make sure we end up in Sub2. Yeah. Um,
Not necessarily browser, like even if you send some requests, yeah.
API, yeah, API requests. Fair enough. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's a good point. I'll see what Andy thinks. I'm curious what he thinks, and we'll go from there. That's a good point because we don't have any end-to-end tests yet. So yeah, good point.
Yeah, I think generally we do this in end-to-end tests, and we can have end-to-end test which has some special tag, like we have geo tag, which only runs when geo is set up. We can do the same for sales. We add new tags for this and put a sales tag on it, and it only runs the end-to-end test when sales environment is set up.
Yeah, that's a good point. Good idea. Nice. Anything else we want to discuss? That's the amount of awkward silence I can handle. Have a nice day, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a nice day.
Bye.
Bye-bye.